Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Harmony, watching the stars through the main view screen when his communications officer turned to him with wide eyes. Lieutenant Amy Chen had been monitoring deep space frequencies for 3 years without finding anything more exciting than solar radiation, but today was different. She held her earpiece tight against her head, and her face went pale as she listened to something that made her hands shake. The signal came from beyond the outer rim, where no human ship had ever traveled. It was weak and broken, but clearly artificial. Jake moved to Amy's station and put on a second headset. Through the static, he heard voices speaking in a language that was definitely not human. The words were musical and flowing like water over rocks, but underneath the beauty was something else. Fear and desperation filled every transmission. Jake called his senior staff to the bridge immediately. Dr. Lisa Kane arrived first, carrying her xenobiology scanner and looking more excited than scared. She had spent her whole career studying the possibility of alien life, and now it was finally happening. Colonel Ben Parker came next with his hand resting on his sidearm and his jaw set in a hard line. He trusted nothing that came from unknown space and made no effort to hide his suspicion. The translation computer worked for 6 hours before it could make sense of the alien language. When the first clear message came through, the bridge fell silent. The aliens called themselves Zephyrians, and they were asking for help. Their homeworld was gone, and their people were dying. They had been running from something they called the Devourers for months, and their ships were falling apart. They needed food and medicine and a safe place to land. Dr. Kane immediately began preparing a response offering assistance, but Colonel Parker grabbed her arm. He pointed out that they knew nothing about these aliens or their true intentions. They could be lying about everything. They could be dangerous. They could be planning to attack Earth. Jake listened to both arguments, but his decision came easily. Humans did not turn away from people who needed help, regardless of what species they were. The first Zephyrian ship appeared on their sensors 12 hours later. It was massive, but clearly damaged with hull breaches and failing power systems. Jake ordered his crew to prepare the medical bay and cargo holds for refugees. Dr. Kane studied the atmospheric requirements that the Zephyrians transmitted and found they could breathe human air with minor adjustments. When Admiral Vexitar transported aboard the Harmony, Jake was struck by how human-like the Zephyrians appeared. They stood upright on 2 legs and had 2 arms and recognizable faces. Their skin was pale blue and their eyes were larger than human eyes, but they could have passed for distant cousins. Vexitar wore robes that might have been elegant once but were now torn and stained. He moved like someone carrying a great weight of sadness. Through the translator, Vexitar told his story. The Devourers had appeared in Zephyrian space without warning. They consumed everything in their path, including planets and stars. Billions of Zephyrians had died in the first attacks. The survivors had grabbed what they could and run, but the Devourers followed. Ship after ship had been lost during the escape. Now, only a few thousand Zephyrians remained from a civilization that once numbered in the billions. Dr. Kane asked detailed questions about Zephyrian biology and culture. She learned they were peaceful people who valued art and science above all else. They had never developed powerful weapons because they had never needed them. When the Devourers came, they had no way to fight back. Vexitar showed her images of Zephyrian cities before the attack. They were beautiful places full of gardens and flowing architecture that seemed to grow from the ground itself. Jake contacted Earth immediately and spoke directly with President Helen Brooks. He transmitted all the data they had gathered about the Zephyrians and requested permission to offer them sanctuary. The president called an emergency session of the World Council. Representatives from every nation on Earth debated for 18 hours before reaching their decision. Colonel Parker argued against trusting the aliens. He pointed out that everything they knew came from Zephyrian sources. There was no independent verification of their story. The Devourers could be a lie designed to make humans feel sorry for them. The whole thing could be an elaborate trick to get access to Earth's defenses. Several council members agreed with his concerns, but Dr. Kane spoke for the majority when she reminded the Council of humanity's greatest strength. Humans helped others because it was the right thing to do. They had always opened their doors to refugees regardless of the cost. If they turned away the Zephyrians now, they would lose something essential about what made them human. Earth had the resources to help, and therefore they had the responsibility to help. President Brooks announced Earth's decision to the galaxy. Humanity would provide sanctuary for all Zephyrian refugees. They would share their technology and their worlds to help the survivors rebuild their civilization. The Zephyrians would be treated as honored guests and given everything they needed to heal from their terrible losses. Vexitar wept when he heard the translation. He fell to his knees and thanked Jake and all of humanity for their kindness. He promised that Zephyrians would never forget this generosity. They would work alongside humans to build a better future for both species. Together they would stand against the darkness that threatened all life in the galaxy. 3 years had passed since the Zephyrians first arrived, and Earth had transformed itself to accommodate their new neighbors. Ambassador Claire Williams walked through the central plaza of New Haven, watching human and Zephyrian children play together in the afternoon sun. The sight filled her with pride because it proved that two different species could live in harmony when they chose to trust each other. New Haven was the largest of 12 worlds that Earth had given to the Zephyrian refugees. The planet had been terraformed specifically for their needs with the right atmospheric pressure and temperature ranges. Human engineers had worked day and night to build cities that matched Zephyrian architectural preferences. The flowing organic shapes looked strange to human eyes, but the Zephyrians called them beautiful, and that was all that mattered. Sam Rodriguez stood in his workshop surrounded by hybrid technology that combined human engineering with Zephyrian design principles. He had been working with Dr. Korth for 2 years now, and their partnership had produced amazing results. The Zephyrians had taught humans how to grow metal structures instead of building them, which saved enormous amounts of time and resources. In return, Sam had shown them how to make their materials stronger and more durable using human manufacturing techniques. Dr. Korth was everything humans hoped aliens would be. He was brilliant and curious and eager to learn. He asked endless questions about human culture and history and seemed genuinely fascinated by everything he discovered. Sam enjoyed their long conversations about science and engineering, but he also appreciated how Dr. Korth always remembered to ask about his family and his hobbies. The Zephyrians seemed to understand that friendship meant more than just professional collaboration. Dr. Nina Foster had made even greater breakthroughs in the medical field. Zephyrian physiology was similar enough to human biology that many Earth treatments could be adapted for their use. She had developed cures for 3 different Zephyrian diseases that had plagued their species for centuries. The grateful patients often brought her gifts from their homeworld traditions, and she kept them all displayed proudly in her office. The cultural exchange programs were Professor Carl Davis's greatest achievement. Human universities now offered courses in Zephyrian art and philosophy, while Zephyrian scholars taught their own students about human history and literature. The first joint graduation ceremony had brought tears to everyone's eyes when human and Zephyrian students walked across the stage together to receive their degrees. But not everyone was completely satisfied with how things were developing. Maya Thompson sat in her small office at Earth Intelligence, studying reports that troubled her deeply. She had been tracking Zephyrian activities across human space and had noticed patterns that made no sense for a refugee population. Too many of their research expeditions targeted systems that contained rare minerals used in military applications. Too many of their survey teams requested access to areas near important human installations. Maya had brought her concerns to Director Greg Martinez multiple times, but he always dismissed them as paranoia. He reminded her that the Zephyrians were traumatized survivors who had lost everything. It was natural that they would be interested in understanding their new environment. Their scientific curiosity was one of the things that made them such good partners for humanity. Maya should focus on real threats instead of imagining problems where none existed. The director's attitude frustrated Maya because she was not imagining anything. Her job required her to look for suspicious patterns, and the patterns were definitely there. Zephyrian ships appeared in strategic locations far more often than random chance would explain. Their research requests always seemed to focus on the most sensitive areas of human space. When she tried to investigate further, she found that many Zephyrian activities were classified at levels above her security clearance. Meanwhile, the Zephyrians continued to impress everyone with their gratitude and cooperation. Admiral Vextar had been promoted to Supreme Coordinator of Zephyrian Affairs, and he met regularly with human leaders to discuss their ongoing partnership. He always emphasized how much his people appreciated Earth's generosity and how eager they were to contribute to their shared future. He spoke movingly about Zephyrian values of peace and harmony and how well they aligned with human ideals. The Zephyrians had also proven to be valuable allies in preparing for the eventual threat of the Devourers. They shared detailed intelligence about their enemies' capabilities and tactics. According to Vextar, the Devourers were machines that consumed organic matter to fuel their expansion across the galaxy. They could not be reasoned with or negotiated with. The only way to survive their arrival was to be ready to fight with everything available. This intelligence had convinced human leaders to accelerate their military development programs. Earth's industrial capacity was redirected toward building faster ships and more powerful weapons. The Zephyrians offered to help with these efforts by sharing their knowledge of Devourer technology and tactics. Vextar requested access to human military facilities so that Zephyrian experts could better advise human commanders about defensive strategies. Sam Rodriguez felt honored when Dr. Korth asked for his help with a special project. The Zephyrian scientist wanted to upgrade the defensive systems on several Zephyrian colonies using human technology. He explained that his people were still traumatized by their helplessness against the Devourers and would feel safer with better protection. Sam was happy to help his friend feel more secure and began sharing detailed specifications for Earth's most advanced defensive technologies. Dr. Foster received similar requests from Zephyrian medical researchers who wanted to understand human biological systems better. They claimed this knowledge would help them develop treatments that could work for both species in case of Devourer attacks that involved biological weapons. Foster was eager to help and provided complete genetic and biological data about human physiology. Professor Davis organized cultural missions that allowed Zephyrian scholars to visit important human historical sites and research facilities. The visitors were always respectful and grateful, and they produced beautiful artistic works inspired by what they learned. Their exhibitions were popular on both human and Zephyrian worlds and seemed to prove that the partnership between the species was growing stronger every day. Claire Williams often stood in her office looking out at the thriving community of New Haven and feeling proud of what humanity had accomplished. They had taken a group of desperate refugees and helped them build new lives filled with hope and purpose. The success of the Zephyrian integration proved that Earth's values of compassion and cooperation could work on a galactic scale. Humanity had shown the universe that different species could live together in peace when they chose to see each other as friends rather than threats. 5 years into the alliance, Commander Tony Harrison received reports that made his stomach turn cold. His patrol ships had been monitoring the outer colonies as part of routine security sweeps when they discovered something that should not have existed. Several Zephyrian settlements were building military installations that looked nothing like the peaceful research facilities they were supposed to be constructing. The structures were heavily fortified with weapon emplacements and shield generators that could protect against orbital bombardment. The Zephyrians claimed they were necessary defenses against potential Devourer attacks, but Tony had studied enough military architecture to recognize offensive capabilities when he saw them. These were not defensive positions, they were staging areas for invasion forces. Tony compiled detailed reports with photographs and sensor readings showing the true nature of Zephyrian construction projects. He submitted them through proper channels and waited for the response that never came. His reports disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, and his requests for investigation were denied by officials who seemed more interested in protecting political relationships than addressing security concerns. When Tony tried to discuss his findings with his superiors, he was told that the Zephyrians were entitled to defend themselves however they chose. Earth had given them these worlds, and they had the right to build whatever they needed to feel safe. Any attempt to restrict their construction would be seen as a betrayal of the trust that had been built between the species. Tony should focus on his assigned patrol duties and stop looking for problems where none existed. Dr. Janet Pierce was facing similar frustrations in her archaeological work. She had been studying Zephyrian historical records as part of a joint research project when she discovered inconsistencies that could not be explained by translation errors or cultural differences. The dates did not match up correctly, and some events appeared to have been deliberately altered or removed from the official histories. Most troubling were the references to the Devourers themselves. According to the oldest Zephyrian records, the Devourers had supposedly been attacking their space for decades, but Janet found evidence suggesting that these attacks had only begun recently. Even more disturbing were fragments of text that seemed to describe the Devourers not as mindless machines, but as a deliberate military force under Zephyrian command. Janet tried to publish her findings in academic journals, but faced unexpected resistance. Her papers were rejected without proper review, and she received anonymous messages warning her to stop her research. When she attempted to present her work at conferences, she found that her speaking slots had been mysteriously canceled or moved to times when no one would attend. Someone with significant influence was working very hard to keep her discoveries secret. Captain Steve Mitchell and his partner Captain Linda Hayes were discovering their own troubling evidence during border patrol missions. They had noticed an unusual number of lost Zephyrian vessels wandering near strategic human systems. These ships claimed to be conducting routine surveys or suffering from navigation failures, but their equipment told a different story. The lost ships carried sophisticated scanning arrays that were mapping human defensive networks with incredible precision. They were recording the locations of military bases and industrial facilities and measuring the response times of human patrol forces. When Steve and Linda tried to board these vessels for inspection, they were told that diplomatic immunity protected Zephyrian ships from search and seizure. Linda had managed to secretly scan several of these ships during rescue operations and discovered that their databases contained detailed intelligence about human military capabilities. The information was far more comprehensive than anything refugees would need for their own protection. It looked like preparation for a military campaign against human targets. Steve and Linda submitted their own reports documenting the suspicious Zephyrian activities, but received the same response that Tony had gotten. Their superiors accused them of being paranoid and xenophobic. The Zephyrians were allies and guests who deserved the benefit of doubt. Any suggestion that they might have hostile intentions was insulting to the friendship between the species. Meanwhile, Admiral Vextar was making new requests that should have raised immediate alarm bells. He wanted access to Earth's most sensitive military installations for better coordination against the Devourer threat. He claimed that Zephyrian tactical experts needed to study human defensive strategies to identify weaknesses that the Devourers might exploit. This knowledge would allow them to recommend improvements that could save millions of human lives. The request was approved by politicians who saw it as proof of growing trust between the species. Vextar was given clearance to visit classified facilities and review secret defensive plans. He brought teams of Zephyrian experts who asked detailed questions about every aspect of human military organization. They were particularly interested in command structures and communication protocols that would be essential for coordinating any defensive response. Dr. Korth continued his collaboration with Sam Rodriguez, but his requests had become more specific and more troubling. He wanted detailed specifications for human computer systems and communication networks. He claimed this information was necessary for integrating Zephyrian and human technologies more effectively. Sam was happy to help his friend, but began to wonder why Dr. Korth needed such comprehensive access to Earth's most sensitive systems. The Zephyrian scientist had also begun asking personal questions about Sam's colleagues and their security clearances. He wanted to know who had access to what information and how that access was controlled. When Sam asked why this mattered, Dr. Korth explained that Zephyrian research teams needed to know who they could work with on various projects. The explanation made sense, but something about the way Dr. Korth asked these questions made Sam uncomfortable. Dr. Foster was providing her Zephyrian colleagues with increasingly detailed information about human biology and psychology. They claimed to be developing new medical treatments, but their questions focused on vulnerabilities rather than healing. They wanted to know what substances were toxic to humans and what psychological techniques were most effective for controlling human behavior. Foster began to suspect that her research was being used for purposes she had never intended. Professor Davis noticed that his Zephyrian cultural exchange students were asking unusual questions about human history and social organization. They seemed particularly interested in how human societies had collapsed in the past and what factors made human populations most vulnerable to external manipulation. When Davis asked about their research interests, they claimed to be studying historical parallels that might help predict devourer tactics. Maya Thompson finally gathered enough evidence to demand a meeting with Director Martinez, despite his previous dismissals of her concerns. She presented him with a comprehensive analysis, showing that Zephyrian activities followed patterns consistent with a large-scale intelligence-gathering operation. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, but Martinez refused to act on it. The director told Maya that her analysis was based on suspicion rather than facts. The Zephyrians had legitimate reasons for everything they were doing, and any attempt to restrict their activities would damage Earth's reputation throughout the galaxy. Maya was ordered to stop her investigation and focus on monitoring actual threats rather than imagined ones. If she continued to pursue this matter, she would face disciplinary action that could end her career. Maya left the meeting knowing that something terrible was being planned, but also knowing that no one in authority would listen to her warnings. The Zephyrians had been so successful at presenting themselves as grateful refugees that questioning their motives had become politically impossible. Earth's leaders were so invested in the success of the alliance that they refused to see evidence of betrayal even when it was staring them in the face. Lieutenant Kate Johnson was working the night shift at the communications monitoring station when she intercepted the transmission that changed everything. She had been tracking routine Zephyrian communications traffic when her equipment picked up a heavily encrypted signal coming from Admiral Vextar's flagship. The encryption was sophisticated, but human code-breaking technology had advanced significantly since first contact. Kate worked for 6 hours to decode the message, and what she found made her hands shake with rage and fear. The transmission was a detailed report to someone called the High Command describing the success of the infiltration operation. Vextar was providing updates on human military capabilities and defensive weaknesses that had been gathered by Zephyrian agents embedded throughout human space. The message revealed that the Zephyrians were not refugees at all, but advanced scouts for a massive invasion fleet. The Devourer War had been completely fabricated to exploit human compassion and gain access to strategic positions throughout Earth's territory. Every act of kindness and generosity that humans had shown had been carefully catalogued and turned into a weapon against them. Kate immediately contacted General Frank Russell, who commanded Earth's defensive forces. Russell read the decoded transmission with growing horror as he realized the scope of the deception. The Zephyrians had been playing a role for 5 years, while systematically gathering intelligence and positioning themselves for conquest. They had studied human psychology and used humanity's greatest strength against them. Russell tried to activate Earth's defensive protocols, but discovered that Zephyrian researchers had planted sophisticated malware throughout the communication networks. Critical systems were responding slowly, or not at all. Military bases were reporting equipment failures and communication blackouts. The Zephyrians had been preparing for this moment for years, and their sabotage was devastatingly effective. Dr. Korth revealed his true nature when Sam Rodriguez confronted him about suspicious data requests. The friendly scientist dropped his mask of cooperation and smiled coldly as he explained that Sam had been an excellent source of information. Every technical specification and system design that Sam had shared had been transmitted to Zephyrian military engineers who were using it to build weapons specifically designed to defeat human defenses. Sam felt sick as he realized how completely he had been manipulated. His friendship with Dr. Korth had been nothing but a professional relationship designed to extract valuable intelligence. Every personal conversation and every moment of trust had been calculated to make Sam more willing to share sensitive information. The Zephyrian had never seen him as anything more than a useful tool. Dr. Foster made similar discoveries when she investigated her Zephyrian medical colleagues. The treatments they had been developing were not intended to heal, but to harm. They had used her research to create biological weapons specifically targeted at human physiology. The detailed genetic information she had provided would allow them to engineer diseases that could kill millions of humans while leaving Zephyrians completely unaffected. President Helen Brooks convened an emergency session of the World Council as reports poured in from across human space. Zephyrian colonies were dropping their pretense of peaceful settlement and revealing military installations that had been hidden beneath fake civilian structures. Ships that had been registered as research vessels were deploying weapons and taking control of strategic positions throughout the outer systems. Admiral Vexistar contacted Earth directly with a message that confirmed humanity's worst fears. He dropped the act of gratitude and cooperation that had fooled human leaders for 5 years and spoke with the cold authority of a military commander addressing conquered enemies. The Zephyrian Empire had decided that humans were too valuable, as servants to be completely destroyed, but too dangerous as equals to be allowed freedom. Vextar offered humanity a choice between slavery and extinction. They could surrender immediately and accept Zephyrian rule, or they could resist and face complete annihilation. He pointed out that Zephyrian forces now controlled 12 heavily fortified worlds within human territory and possessed detailed intelligence about every aspect of human military organization. Earth's defensive networks had been compromised, and their most sensitive technologies had been stolen. The Admiral seemed genuinely puzzled by human expressions of anger and betrayal. He explained that deception was a normal part of warfare and humans should have been more careful about trusting strangers. The Zephyrians had simply used human emotions against them in the same way that humans might use superior technology against a less advanced enemy. There was no reason to take the deception personally. General Russell realized that conventional military responses would be ineffective against an enemy that knew all of Earth's tactical doctrines and defensive strategies. The Zephyrians had studied human warfare for 5 years and prepared countermeasures for every standard approach. Any attack using normal methods would fail because the enemy already knew exactly what humans would try to do. Maya Thompson was finally vindicated when her intelligence reports became required reading for every human commander. Her analysis of Zephyrian activities provided the only comprehensive picture of enemy capabilities and intentions. The patterns she had identified were now revealed as elements of a carefully planned conquest strategy that had been years in development. But Maya took no satisfaction in being proven right, because the situation was far worse than even she had imagined. The Zephyrians had not simply been gathering intelligence, but actively undermining human society from within. They had identified and cultivated human collaborators who were now working to sabotage defensive efforts from inside Earth's own government and military. Commander Tony Harrison discovered that several of his fellow officers had been compromised by Zephyrian agents. These humans had been convinced that resistance was hopeless and that cooperation with the invaders was the only way to minimize casualties. They were actively working to prevent effective military responses and spreading defeatist propaganda among their colleagues. Dr. Janet Pierce's archaeological research suddenly became vitally important as human leaders realized they needed to understand their enemy's true history and motivations. Her evidence that the Devourers were actually under Zephyrian control suggested that the invasion fleet would include weapons and tactics that humans had never encountered. The refugees had been studying human responses to their fake enemy for years. Captain Steve Mitchell and Captain Linda Hayes found themselves among the few Border Patrol officers who had not been compromised by Zephyrian intelligence operations. Their detailed reports about suspicious ship movements now provided crucial intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities. They began organizing resistance cells among the patrol forces who could still be trusted. The scale of the betrayal was almost impossible for human minds to process. Every act of friendship had been fake. Every moment of cooperation had been calculated. Every expression of gratitude had been part of an elaborate deception designed to position humanity for conquest. The Zephyrians had spent 5 years studying human psychology and using that knowledge to exploit every weakness in human nature. But Admiral Vextar had made one critical error in his analysis of human behavior. He had studied human kindness and human trust, but he had never bothered to learn about human anger. The same species that was capable of such generous hospitality was also capable of terrible fury when that hospitality was violated. The Zephyrians were about to discover that betraying human friendship carried a price they had never imagined. Major Paul Garcia had spent his career studying human conflicts, and he understood something that the Zephyrians had missed in their analysis of Earth's military capabilities. Humans were most dangerous when they fought with righteous anger rather than cold calculation. The betrayal had awakened something in humanity that no amount of intelligence gathering could have prepared the Zephyrians to face. Garcia assembled teams of specialists who began hunting down Zephyrian agents throughout human space. These were not the obvious military targets, but the embedded intelligence operatives who had been posing as researchers and cultural exchange students. The hunt required a different kind of warfare than anything in human military doctrine, but Garcia had studied insurgency tactics from Earth's violent history. The key was turning the Zephyrians' own methods against them. They had succeeded by exploiting human trust and openness, but that same openness meant that humans understood their guests better than the guests understood themselves. Garcia's teams knew where every Zephyrian lived and worked, because humanity had been keeping careful records to ensure their comfort and safety. Dr. Lisa Kane felt personally betrayed by Dr. Korth's deception, but she channeled that anger into something productive. Her detailed knowledge of Zephyrian biology became the foundation for developing countermeasures that could disable their equipment and neutralize their advantages. She had spent years learning how their bodies worked, and now she used that knowledge to create weapons specifically designed to exploit their weaknesses. Kane's research revealed that Zephyrians were vulnerable to certain electromagnetic frequencies that would cause severe disorientation and temporary paralysis. Human technology could easily generate these frequencies, and Kane worked with engineering teams to develop devices that could incapacitate Zephyrian forces without causing permanent harm. Humanity would show mercy even in warfare, but that mercy would be entirely on human terms. Admiral Susan Kelly took command of what remained of Earth's naval forces after the initial Zephyrian sabotage. Many ships had been disabled by malware, but Kelly had learned from the enemy's tactics and began implementing strategies they would never expect. Instead of fighting a conventional space battle, she adopted asymmetric warfare techniques that had served humans well throughout their violent history. Kelly's forces began operating in small independent cells that could strike quickly and disappear before Zephyrian forces could respond. They used the intimate knowledge of local space that came from years of human exploration and colonization. The Zephyrians might have maps and sensor data, but humans knew every asteroid and debris field in their own territory. Captain. Jake Morrison had been promoted to Admiral after his role in First Contact, but he felt responsible for the disaster that had followed. His decision to trust the Zephyrians had given them access to human space, and now millions of lives were at risk. Morrison threw himself into planning the counterattack with the fury of someone who had been made to look like a fool. Morrison understood that the Zephyrians expected humans to fight like the peaceful species they appeared to be. The invaders had studied human military doctrine, but they had focused on formal warfare between organized armies. They had not considered how humans fought when their survival was threatened and conventional tactics had failed. Sam Rodriguez felt sick every time he thought about how his friendship with Dr. Korth had been exploited, but he refused to let guilt paralyze him. Instead, he used his knowledge of the technology he had shared to develop counters and sabotage techniques. Every system he had helped the Zephyrians understand could be turned against them with the right modifications. Rodriguez worked with other engineers who had been similarly deceived to create viruses that would target the hybrid technologies they had helped develop. The Zephyrians had adapted human systems to their own needs, but that adaptation created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by people who understood both sets of technology. Dr. Nina Foster discovered that her medical research could be weaponized in ways the Zephyrians had never anticipated. She had developed treatments for Zephyrian diseases, but she also understood their immune systems better than anyone else in human space. Foster began working on biological agents that would disable Zephyrian forces without killing them, because humanity would not stoop to genocide even against betrayers. The psychological warfare was equally important. Professor Carl Davis used his understanding of Zephyrian culture to develop propaganda that would undermine their morale and unity. The cultural exchange programs had taught him how Zephyrian society functioned, and he used that knowledge to identify pressure points that could cause internal conflicts within their forces. Maya. Thompson finally received the resources and authority she needed to coordinate intelligence operations against the Zephyrian occupation forces. Her years of studying their activities had given her insights that proved invaluable for planning resistance operations. She knew their schedules and their procedures and their weaknesses because she had been watching them for so long. Thompson organized networks of human civilians who could gather intelligence and carry out sabotage operations without being detected by Zephyrian security forces. The invaders had prepared for military resistance, but they had not expected to face an entire population that was working against them with coordinated purpose. The first major success came when Garcia's teams simultaneously struck Zephyrian intelligence centers across 12 worlds. The operations were timed to prevent any warning from reaching other targets, and the results exceeded all expectations. Years of carefully gathered intelligence was destroyed, and dozens of key operatives were captured or eliminated. The Zephyrians responded with increased security measures, but they were fighting an enemy that knew their territory better than they did. Human resistance fighters could move through areas that the invaders thought were secure. They could strike at targets that should have been impossible to reach. They could disappear into populations that looked identical to Zephyrian eyes, but who were all working together against the occupation. Admiral Kelly's naval forces began scoring victories against Zephyrian ships that had seemed invincible just weeks before. The key was refusing to fight the kind of battle the enemy expected. Instead of meeting them in open space, Kelly's forces used guerrilla tactics that made every engagement unpredictable and chaotic. The Zephyrians found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to know their every move, while remaining completely unpredictable themselves. Human forces would appear from unexpected directions, using routes that should not have existed. They would attack with weapons that should not have worked against Zephyrian defenses. They would retreat through escape paths that led to places no Zephyrian had ever mapped. Most disturbing for the invaders was the realization that humans were not fighting with the desperate fury of a conquered people, but with the cold efficiency of experienced predators. Every attack was precisely calculated to achieve maximum effect with minimum resources. Every operation revealed new aspects of human tactical thinking that the Zephyrians had never encountered. Admiral Vextar began receiving reports that made no sense according to his understanding of human psychology. The species that had shown such compassion and generosity was now displaying a capacity for strategic violence that seemed impossible to reconcile with their previous behavior. His intelligence had been wrong about something fundamental regarding human nature. The resistance was spreading faster than Zephyrian forces could contain it. What had begun as isolated cells was becoming a coordinated campaign that spanned multiple star systems. Humans were sharing information and resources with an efficiency that suggested years of preparation, even though the invasion had caught them completely by surprise. The truth was that humans had been preparing for this kind of war for their entire history without realizing it. Every conflict on Earth had taught lessons about fighting against superior forces and turning weaknesses into strengths. The Zephyrians had studied human military science, but they had ignored human military experience, and that oversight was proving fatal to their conquest plans. The war lasted exactly 73 days from the moment Admiral Vextar dropped his mask until the last Zephyrian commander surrendered. What the invaders had expected to be a simple conquest became a nightmare that would be studied by military historians for centuries. They had planned for every possible human response except the one they actually faced. Admiral Susan Kelly stood on the bridge of her flagship, watching Zephyrian ships flee from the outer rim systems they had controlled for 5 years. Her forces had recaptured every occupied world using tactics that combined human creativity with devastating effectiveness. The same species that had welcomed refugees with open arms had proven equally capable of ejecting invaders with ruthless precision. The key to human victory had been the realization that the Zephyrians understood human kindness but had never bothered to study human conflict. They knew how humans behaved when they were being generous, but they had no idea how humans fought when they were truly angry. That gap in their intelligence had proven fatal to their conquest plans. Colonel Ben Parker led the assault on New Haven, where Ambassador Claire Williams had been imprisoned since the invasion began. The liberation revealed the full extent of Zephyrian cruelty toward their hosts. The aliens had taken particular pleasure in humiliating the humans who had shown them the greatest kindness. Williams was found in a cell designed to maximize psychological torment. Parker's forces discovered evidence that the Zephyrians had been planning to use human prisoners as experimental subjects for biological weapons testing. The same medical research that Dr. Nina Foster had shared to help heal Zephyrian diseases had been turned into instruments of torture and murder. The discovery eliminated any remaining sympathy that human forces might have felt for their former guests. The final battle occurred when Admiral Vextar's main invasion fleet arrived, expecting to find human space already conquered and ready for occupation. Instead, they encountered Kelly's forces, backed by the full industrial might of humanity, now turned toward war. The Zephyrians had studied human defensive capabilities, but they had never seen what humans could build when they were truly motivated. The battle lasted 18 hours and ended with the complete destruction or capture of the Zephyrian fleet. Vextar himself was taken alive when his flagship was boarded by forces led by Captain Jake Morrison. The former refugee leader found himself facing the same human officer who had first welcomed him with friendship and trust 5 years earlier. Morrison looked at Vextar without anger or hatred, but with the cold satisfaction of someone who had learned an important lesson about the galaxy's true nature. The Admiral tried to justify his actions by claiming that deception was simply part of warfare, but Morrison cut him off with a simple statement. Humans now understood that kindness was a luxury they could no longer afford. Dr. Korth was captured during a raid on a research facility where he had been developing biological weapons based on information provided by Sam Rodriguez. The Zephyrian scientist showed no remorse for betraying the friendship that had been offered to him. He seemed genuinely confused by human anger over his deception and claimed that any species foolish enough to trust strangers deserved whatever happened to them. Rodriguez looked at his former friend and colleague with disgust rather than anger. The betrayal had taught him that friendship required mutual respect and honesty. The Zephyrians had never seen humans as equals worthy of truth. They had viewed them as tools to be manipulated and discarded when they were no longer useful. The war crimes tribunals began immediately after the fighting ended. Human justice demanded that every Zephyrian involved in the deception face accountability for their actions. The trials revealed the full scope of the invasion plan and the calculated cruelty with which it had been implemented. Every act of kindness had been catalogued and turned into a weapon against its giver. Dr. Janet Pierce served as a key witness during the trials by presenting evidence of how Zephyrian historical records had been deliberately falsified to support their deception. Her archaeological research proved that the Devourer War had never existed and that the refugee story had been created specifically to exploit human compassion. Maya Thompson's intelligence analysis became the foundation for understanding how the Zephyrians had planned and executed their infiltration of human society. Her years of ignored warnings were finally recognized as the work of a professional who had seen through sophisticated deception when her superiors had been blinded by political considerations. The trials established that over 40,000 Zephyrians had been directly involved in the invasion plan, while millions more had known about it and chosen to participate in the deception. Only a few hundred had genuinely opposed the operation, and they were offered asylum on human worlds as protection against retaliation from their own people. Admiral Vextar was sentenced to life imprisonment after being convicted of war crimes, including the planned genocide of human populations. During his final statement, he expressed no remorse for his actions and warned humans that other species would eventually succeed where the Zephyrians had failed. The galaxy was full of predators who would see human kindness as weakness to be exploited. President Helen Brooks addressed the galaxy from Earth with a message that would reshape interstellar relations for generations. Humanity remained committed to peace and cooperation with species that approached them honestly, but they would no longer extend automatic trust to strangers who claimed to need help. The age of human innocence was over. The message included detailed documentation of Zephyrian crimes and the methods they had used to deceive human society. Other species studying the information would understand that humans had learned to distinguish between genuine refugees and sophisticated infiltrators. Future deceptions would be met with immediate and overwhelming force. Dr. Lisa Kane established new protocols for contact with alien species that balanced human compassion with necessary security measures. Refugees would still be helped, but only after thorough verification of their claims and careful monitoring of their activities. Humanity would remain generous, but they would no longer be naive. The 12 worlds that had been given to the Zephyrians were repurposed as memorial sites and research facilities. New Haven became a training center where human diplomats and intelligence officers learned to recognize deception and manipulation. The beautiful cities that had been built with such hope became monuments to the price of misplaced trust. Sam Rodriguez continued his engineering work, but with new partners who had proven their honesty through years of cooperation. He never again shared sensitive technical information without proper authorization and security review. The friendship he had lost taught him that true cooperation required mutual respect and transparency. Captain Morrison was promoted to Fleet Admiral and given responsibility for developing new first contact protocols. His experience with the Zephyrians made him the ideal person to balance human openness with necessary caution. Future alien visitors would find humans friendly, but not foolish. The galaxy learned that Earth's open hand could indeed become a closed fist when circumstances required it. Humanity had demonstrated both their capacity for generosity and their ability to punish those who betrayed that generosity. The message was clear to any species considering exploitation of human kindness. Dr. Maya Thompson delivered the final assessment in her report to the World Council. The Zephyrians had made the fatal error of mistaking human mercy for weakness and human openness for vulnerability. They had learned too late that the same species capable of such generous hospitality was equally capable of righteous fury when that hospitality was violated. Humanity's greatest strength remained their ability to extend trust and friendship to others, but their second greatest strength was making those who betrayed that trust deeply regret their choice. The galaxy now understood that both sides of human nature were equally real and equally dangerous to ignore.